In the summer of 1945, Britain stood victorious. The flags were flying. The crowds were singing. The war was over. But behind the celebrations, something far more dangerous than Hitler had already won. Britain had defeated its enemy on the battlefield, and in doing so, it had quietly destroyed itself. This is the story of how winning the greatest war in history cost a nation its future. In September 1939, when Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, it did not enter the conflict as a weak or desperate nation. On paper, Britain was still one of the richest and most powerful countries on Earth. The British Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe. Its currency was trusted. Its banks were respected. Its shipping lanes connected continents. London was the financial heart of the world. British companies owned railways in South America, mines in Africa, factories in Asia, and industries inside the United States itself. Britain had ruled the global economy for more than a century, not just through armies and colonies, but through money. Britain depended on imports: food from North America, oil from overseas, raw materials from across the world. Even before the war, Britain imported more than half of what its population consumed. Once war began, that dependence became lethal. German U-boats turned the Atlantic into a killing ground. Merchant ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Every convoy that reached Britain was not just cargo, but survival. At first, Britain paid for this survival the way it always had: with cash, with gold, with foreign investments. American factories were happy to sell planes, trucks, weapons, and ammunition. But there was a condition. The United States was officially neutral. Congress had passed laws that banned loans to countries at war. America would sell weapons, but only under one rule: cash and carry. Britain had to pay immediately, and Britain had to transport the goods itself. So Britain began liquidating its wealth. Gold reserves that had been built over generations were shipped across the Atlantic. Overseas investments were quietly sold. In a secret operation, Britain loaded its national gold onto warships and sent it to Canada for safekeeping, away from German bombs. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in human history. Britain was not just fighting a war. It was converting its past into fuel for the present. By 1940, the strain was becoming unbearable. The Luftwaffe bombed British cities night after night. Factories burned. Homes collapsed. Civilian morale was tested. Yet the deeper crisis was invisible. Britain was running out of money. The war was consuming dollars faster than Britain could earn them. Contracts for American aircraft sat unsigned. Orders for weapons stalled. Britain could still fight, but it could no longer pay. It was in this moment that Winston Churchill wrote one of the most important letters of his life. In December 1940, from an underground war room beneath London, Churchill wrote to the American president. His words were carefully chosen. He described the military situation. He described the U-boat threat. He described Britain's determination to fight on. But buried inside the letter was an admission no British leader had ever made to a foreign power. Britain was broke. The nation that had once financed wars for others could no longer finance its own survival. Churchill was not asking for sympathy.
He was asking for time.
For credit.
For a lifeline.
Because without American support, Britain would eventually collapse, not from invasion, but from insolvency. When Franklin Roosevelt read the letter, he understood exactly what was at stake. If Britain fell, the Atlantic would fall with it. And sooner or later, the United States would face the same enemy alone. But Roosevelt faced his own problem. American law forbade direct aid. The American public did not want another European war. Any help to Britain had to look like business, not charity. And so, quietly, a new idea began to take shape. A system that would keep Britain alive without openly breaking the law. A system that would later be presented as generosity, but would, in reality, become one of the most expensive bargains in British history. The solution that emerged was called Lend-Lease, and on the surface, it sounded simple. Britain would receive weapons, food, fuel, and supplies from the United States without paying cash up front. Instead, the materials would be lent for the duration of the war. Once the war ended, Britain would return what it could, or settle accounts later. To the public, it was framed as neighborly assistance. Roosevelt compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. But behind closed doors, Lend-Lease was not charity. It was leverage. Before a single crate of supplies was shipped, American officials demanded proof that Britain had exhausted every possible resource. The U.S. Treasury insisted on a full accounting of British assets, not just government reserves, but private investments owned by British citizens around the world. Nothing could be hidden. Nothing could be protected. Britain was being treated not as a proud ally, but as a bankrupt corporation seeking emergency credit. American negotiators made their position clear. If Britain still owned profitable assets, especially inside the United States, then American taxpayers should not be paying the bill.
Britain would have to sell first.
Only then would aid flow. One of the most painful examples was the forced sale of American Viscose, a massive industrial company that dominated synthetic fiber production in the United States. It was British-owned. It was profitable. And it generated millions of dollars that flowed back to Britain every year. To American officials, it was unacceptable that such an asset remained untouched while Britain asked for help. Under intense pressure, Britain was forced to sell. The sale was rushed. Buyers knew Britain had no choice. The price was slashed. What should have been a strategic asset for post-war recovery was liquidated at a fraction of its value. The dollars from the sale went directly to paying American suppliers. Britain lost the company forever. This was not an isolated case. Across the war years, Britain sold off overseas investments piece by piece. Railways, utilities, factories, insurance holdings. Each sale weakened Britain's long-term economic position. But the war allowed no alternative. Survival came first. Even Britain's strategic geography became currency. In exchange for outdated American destroyers, Britain granted the United States long-term leases on naval and air bases across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. From Newfoundland to Jamaica, from Bermuda to Trinidad, American forces gained a permanent foothold. It was a trade that reshaped global power. Britain received short-term protection. America gained long-term dominance. By the time the United States formally entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Britain was no longer financing the fight. It was dependent on American industry. American factories expanded at unprecedented speed. While Britain converted its entire economy to war production and stopped exporting, American companies filled global markets. Britain's commercial presence shrank. America's grew. The war that saved Britain militarily was hollowing it out economically. By 1945, victory was undeniable. Germany lay defeated. Japan soon followed. Britain stood among the victors. But beneath the triumph, the damage was catastrophic. Britain's gold reserves were gone. Its overseas investments had been stripped. Its exports had collapsed. Its economy was distorted entirely toward war. And its survival now depended on continued American support. British leaders assumed that support would continue. They believed that the sacrifice Britain had made would be recognized. They believed there would be a transition period. They believed wrong. Within days of the war ending, American aid was abruptly cut off. Ships carrying food and supplies were ordered to turn back mid-ocean. The financial oxygen that had kept Britain alive vanished overnight. Britain faced immediate bankruptcy. Without dollars, it could not import food. It could not buy raw materials. It could not restart civilian production. The war was over, and the bill had arrived. Britain had expected gratitude. What it received instead was arithmetic. With Lend-Lease terminated, the British government confronted the numbers and saw the abyss. The country imported nearly half its food and most of its raw materials. During the war, these imports had been paid for with American dollars supplied through Lend-Lease. Now the dollars were gone. Rationing, which many assumed would end with peace, tightened instead. Bread was rationed for the first time in British history. Factories lacked materials. Power shortages spread. The victory parades faded into queues and shortages. There was only one path left. Britain had to borrow. In late 1945, a delegation sailed to Washington led by John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist in the world. Keynes was ill and exhausted, but he believed Britain had a moral claim. Britain had fought alone during the darkest years. It had spent its wealth to hold the line. Justice, he argued, demanded a grant, not a loan. $6 billion, he said, would allow Britain to recover without sinking into permanent dependence. The Americans refused. The war was over. The political mood had changed. Aid would no longer be framed as shared survival. It would be framed as business. What Britain was offered was a loan. Not generous. Not forgiving. A commercial loan with interest and with conditions designed to reshape the British economy permanently. The most dangerous condition was currency convertibility. Britain was required to make the pound sterling freely convertible into dollars. On paper, it sounded like free trade. In practice, it was lethal. For years, Britain had forced its empire and trading partners to accept payment in pounds while preventing conversion into dollars. This system protected British industry and conserved scarce reserves. Convertibility would end it overnight. Keynes warned exactly what would happen. The moment the pound became convertible, everyone holding sterling would rush to exchange it for dollars. British reserves would drain at terrifying speed. The loan meant to save Britain would evaporate. He pleaded. He argued. He failed. In July 1946, the loan agreement was signed. In July 1947, convertibility was enacted. Within weeks, Britain hemorrhaged dollars. Reserves collapsed. The government panicked. Convertibility was suspended after barely a month. The damage was done. Britain had burned through much of the loan for nothing. The humiliation was complete. The consequences spread far beyond economics. Britain could no longer afford to police its empire. In 1947, it informed the United States that it could no longer support Greece or Turkey against communist pressure. The message was blunt. Britain was finished. The United States stepped in. The Truman Doctrine was born. The baton of global leadership passed quietly, not through war, but through bankruptcy. The pound was devalued. Imports became more expensive. Living standards fell. Industries struggled. Britain entered an era of austerity that would last for decades. And the debt remained. Year after year, Britain paid interest to the United States. The war had ended in 1945. The payments continued until 2006. 60 years after victory, British taxpayers were still paying for survival. This was the true price of winning the war. Britain had preserved freedom. It had helped save Europe. but it had done so by selling its future. The empire did not collapse in a single moment. It was dismantled through balance sheets, loans, and conditions written in fine print. Power did not change hands on the battlefield. It changed hands in treasury offices. History remembers the speeches, the courage, the defiance. It forgets the invoices. But empires do not fall only to armies. They fall to obligations they can no longer meet. Britain won the war. And in doing so, it lost the world it once controlled.